So I decided to do my research on ancient Roman music and specifically the types of instruments that were used back then because they're somewhat similar but somewhat different to what we know of today, and I thought that was really interesting. Musically, things that the Romans did back then are pretty different because first off, they used a different method of recording the actual music itself. They may have used a Greek method of notation where only 4 letters are the 4 notes that they had, A, G, F, and C, compared to today's 7 note range, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's probably why the instruments back then are built very differently as well. One thing that we have in common with ancient Roman music back then is the groups or types of instruments. So they had woodwinds, strings, and percussion, which we also have today. And I decided to pick out a few from each category to see what was cool about each one, and I decided to draw them as well, which took a little bit of time and they're pretty bad, but hopefully it gives a pretty good visual representation of what they looked like. Out of the percussion instruments, the scabellum was probably the one that looked least like an actual instrument and more like a shoe, as you can see from my drawing. It was a clapper, and it was worn on the right foot, mostly, of a musician, and it had 2 wooden soles which were attached together with a hinge at the back, and there were 2 metallic plates on each sole, and if the musician just tapped their foot, it would act as a metronome, and it would keep the tempo and keep the musician on beat with the song that they were playing. Now, moving on to the woodwinds, we have the Roman tuba, and it doesn't really look like a tuba, it looks more like a long straight trumpet or horn, and it has a detachable cone-shaped mouthpiece, and since it has no valves, it only makes like a single series of sounds, and this tuba used to be used in the military for bugle calls or signals to indicate the start of certain events. Another woodwind we have here is the cornu, and it's also like a horn-like instrument, and it would basically wrap around a musician's body, and it would be shaped like an uppercase G, sort of, and it had a cone-shaped mouthpiece like the Roman tuba, and a hollow bore, the hole at the top where the sound comes out. It's kind of like a French horn if you compare it to an instrument in the modern day, and it was also used for military signals and parades. For the last one of the woodwind series, we have the tibia, and these were basically like 2 recorders. They kind of looked like 2 recorders, and these had 2 double reed pipes, and they were played together along with a mouth band, and these were often played at funerals to drive off evil spirits, and they made really low clarinet sounds. And now we move into strings, and the first instrument is pretty famous, and it is the lyre. And yes, it is the instrument that Hercules used to kill Linus. Anyways, so this was borrowed from the Greeks a long time ago, and it was made from a wooden base, and the strings were stretched across the body, and it kind of looked like a harp, but it kind of wasn't a harp. It was used around 50 BC, and usually it was played sitting down. Unfortunately enough for this poor instrument, the Romans abandoned it after a few years for an upgraded version of the instrument called the cithara, and this was larger and heavier. It had a very sweet and loud sound, and it was used to play more popular and refined music by the Romans. It was played usually standing up because it was bigger, and the one good thing about this instrument is that it could be precisely tuned. That was one ability that was added to this instrument. Last but not least, we have the lute, and this is similar to a modern day guitar, banjo, or maybe a small mandolin, and the strings are stretched across the fretboard, which is the area where you put your fingers to play certain notes, like on a guitar. So these were depicted in art as early as 2340 to 2198 BC, so these are pretty old. And although the lute had fewer strings than the other string instruments like the lyre or the cithara, it did have the ability to produce more notes.